Hello, and welcome to Pacific Mammal Research's Marine Mammal Highlight series. We are a research and education nonprofit studying marine mammals in the Salish Sea off Washington State. In this series, you will learn about different marine mammals as we discuss the interesting facts about each species and debate which one we think is the best. Of course, we think all marine mammals are awesome. This is just our way to geek out, share some information, and have some fun. We hope you enjoy this series, and if you want to hear about a particular marine mammal, let us know in the comments. And without further ado, welcome to the next Marine Mammal Highlights podcast. My name is Cindy.
I'm Kat.
That's my daughter Cordelia, if you hear her in the background.
I'm Trevor.
And Trevor and Kat. All right, so we are talking this week. We decided to do another foraging strategies one because that was super fun last time, and there are as I mentioned, so many different ones that we can look into. And so this week we're going to actually focus just on bottlenose dolphins because they have so many different ways to eat. It's pretty impressive. I'm going to start us off by talking about this one in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which is bottlenose that feed on catfish. Do you guys know what catfish have on their heads?
Don't they have spines on their heads?
They do have spines, and so therefore they can be dangerous, right? Because remember that dolphins will swallow things whole generally, and they don't have like that regurgitation, or the throw up reflex. And so
see
if they
our
tried,
previous podcast.
right? Yes, there's an asphyxiation
For more details.
topic on one of our other podcasts. So if it did try to get back out, it could get lodged in their throat and thus not be able to get it out. So what's interesting about this is that the dolphins, like, what would be a way to get rid of that problem if you still wanted to eat the catfish? What would you have to do?
Bite the head off.
Right. So you'd have to decapitate it.
Creepy.
Which, yeah, never really heard of dolphins doing before, decapitating them. But what's really interesting is that what they've observed is, I'll read it. So sometimes they observe it with the dolphin with the catfish, and sometimes it's these behaviors that they see in the vicinity of floating trails of catfish guts. So, figure that's probably what got eaten. But in this case, it was, they exhibited behavior like rapid surface or lunging out of the water and repeated dives at certain water depths. And sometimes they would observe them actually pursuing the catfish, and then they'd rotate on the long axis. So they would it's called pinwheeling or horizontal circle feeding. So I think is what they're talking about is they go and then they stop and and they turn really quickly as they are pinpointing trying to get to the catfish.
Huh.
And then in another location, it was repeatedly lunging out of the water with the catfish held perpendicular to the rostrum, or that's their mouth, or grasp tail first, leaving the catfish head exposed. And that's a behavior that's hypothesized as a possible method of breaking the fish apart. Although they've never really, what's interesting is that they never actually saw the dolphins do this. So they didn't see them break off the head and then eat it, but they've noticed heads floating in the water. So they didn't eat it. And then they do have indication that catfish was actually found in the stomach of the animal.
Okay, so they know they're consuming it. They know somehow the heads are being detached prior to eating it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And there's no evidence of them coming together to tear it apart, right? That's not.
Yeah, they've not seen them here, you grab the head and I'll grab the tail and rip it apart.
I wouldn't want to be the dolphin grabbing the head. I'm just saying. I wouldn't want that. That would be literally getting the short end of the stick on that deal.
Here, you take the spiky part and I'll take the rest of it. Perfect. So they did that. And what's interesting too is the grasping with it perpendicular. So again, and we talked about this in our asphyxiation episode where the porpoise is eating the large fish, that normally they eat something head first and swallow it whole. So the fact that they're carrying it almost like a dog bone in their mouth is odd. And what we talked about in that episode, and then, you know, kind of goes along with here, is that that's possibly an indication of needing to orient the prey or handle it somehow to make it easier to eat.
Right.
So they're grabbing it and then ideally doing something else. Like the large fish we talked about was grabbed, you know, like that, and then they would have to like, okay, flip it and then ingest it instead of just being able to just basically grab it and do it all in one motion. And so in this case,
Right.
it would be, let's grab it and then somehow decapitate it, which is pretty impressive.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Also, can I say this is a really great one to be talking about right before Halloween?
Right.
Like this is getting a little creepy.
A little bit weird. A little bit weird. It's true. So they did look and at some stranding, and they did see that there were quite a few that had it wasn't like it was stuck in their throat, but they had damage from spines, like they died and then they saw like the damage from spines in their throats. So that's indicating that it is a problem and can be dangerous, right? So if you're not adept at doing it and you don't get all those spines off just right, then maybe you ingest a little one of those, it gets stuck in your throat, and then that can cause other problems such as death, which is a big problem in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. And then the other interesting thing was that they looked at it in the terms of that there may be a certain population or certain individuals within the population that are doing it. So it's not a population-wide thing, right? It's still a low occurrence in the population, but there are so it makes it more important to understand, because if there are a certain group that's doing that, then they may be more susceptible to these bad things happening to them than the rest of the population. So because there might be certain individuals that may be more susceptible to these bad things happening, one thing they found, and this is kind of circumstantial evidence, but there was a pregnant female that had 72 headless fish in her.
Whoa.
Right. That's a lot of fish and a lot of headless fish.
Yeah.
And so as we talked about with the harbor porpoise asphyxiation large fish podcast, it may be these, you know, pregnant females, just there's a lot more going on and they have to eat a lot more. So it may be that those ones are a bit more willing to take this more risky behavior and suffer the consequences of it as well. But that's pretty strong evidence with that many headless fish. And the other thing that they note too is that a lot of prey studies, this is important too, a lot of prey studies are done based on otolith remains, so the inner ear of the fish. If you don't eat the inner ear of the fish, we're not going to have any data that you are eating it using those types of studies.
Right. So it's totally underestimating the amount of catfish that they're actually eating in their population.
Right. Could be, for sure.
Gotcha.
And the one thing that they decided to, or they looked at was that, you know, how are they doing it, right? Because they didn't actually observe it. And what they were looking at is that the teeth might be in combination, like they can grab it and somewhat rip it, because dolphin teeth are bigger than porpoise teeth. But then with the torsional and shearing mechanical force that they're using, that when they see them like, you know, swinging back and forth or whatever, you'll see that with the seals and octopus, right? You know, they're trying to beat it to death, or sea lions with large fish. So the combination of those two possibly allows them to do that. But I think it's interesting though, is like, how is it that they can just do the head? Like, how do they, what are they doing in order to make it so that it rips right at the head?
Right.
Versus the rest of the body. Or maybe they don't. Maybe it goes into a couple pieces and they just don't eat the head part. Don't know. But it's pretty interesting. So that is the prey, the catfish eating, but don't eat the heads because they might kill you section of the bottlenose ones. So that was a more recent discovery as well. This is one, and the next one I'm going to talk about is we discovered a while ago. But it's interesting because we're even though we've been looking at these bottlenose dolphins for much longer than we have any other species, we're constantly surprised by the new things that they invent and do. And it may be that some of these things are because they realize that this is maybe there's more competition for other species, and now all of a sudden it's harder to find it, so they're starting to branch out and say like, well, if I can get this fish, then I've got all these fish that nobody else is trying to eat.
Right.
Which would be good if you're needing food. So the next one I'm going to talk about is we're going to travel a bit to the east from the Gulf of Mexico and over to the Bahamas. And this one's near and dear to my heart because I got to see this a lot while we were doing research in the Bahamas on bottlenose dolphins and spotted dolphins. So the bottlenose dolphins that live there, they do this thing called crater feeding. And what's really cool about this, and we don't see the spotted dolphins doing it. It's just the bottlenose dolphins. So they seem to kind of like, you go to fish, I'll get these fish. We'll do benthic feeding. And the spotted dolphins will also feed from stuff on the bottom, but not in the same way. So they're usually feeding on like flounder that are just underneath the surface and stuff. But the bottlenose dolphin do this peculiar thing where this is about 30 or 40 feet of water, and they'll come to they'll be just under the surface, maybe 5 feet, maybe a little bit more, and they'll sit at the top and they'll rotate their head like this and just go round and round and round like that. And there's no sound that we can hear, at least, right? That's a whole nother podcast. But so they do that, and then all of a sudden they're like, beep, and they zoom down and they go into the sand and they dig their heads down into the sand to the point where their heads are in all the way in up to their pectoral fins in the sand. So it's almost like the ostrich that like sticks their head in the sand. Or I don't know if do ostriches really do that?
I think that might be a myth. Is that?
I think it is, but so the myth of them doing that, right? So it's really neat. So I'll read a little description of it from the paper. This was in the 1990s, the mid 1990s that this was first observed, and I believe to this date it's the only place that we know that they do it. I've not seen any other ones published that say that they crater feed, as far as I know. But they swim slowly in different locations along. So sometimes they're up in the water column, and sometimes they'll do it closer to the bottom. And this is the thing: is you don't see the fish. There's no like, oh, there's the fish that they're going after. You could hear echolocation clicks once they went down. So sometimes they do this, and then they go down, and then you could hear the echolocation at that point. And they'd swim along, and then they'd stop. And then they would dive into the sand and then stick their heads in, and they literally like shake their whole body and dig their heads all the way down. And then we have a couple pictures which are really awesome, where it looks like somebody just took the dolphin, went and stuck their head in the sand. Their pectoral fins. So when they do is they pull out, and they usually will come up with some kind of fish. And the ones that the only prey they were able to identify was a conger eel. And that was actually dropped by one of the crater feeding dolphins. But there are other benthic species like wrasses and clinids. But we don't know because they eat it before we can see what they eat. Yeah.
So they're eating it while they're in the crater. They're grabbing it and consuming it under the sand?
They're grabbing it and they'll pull out, and then they'll eat it right out after they get out of the sand, but it's not enough time for us to be able to go down and see. And because generally also too, they're 20, 30 feet down below, and we can some of us are not as good free divers as others. And it's hard to stay down there for any length of time to be able to see it. So, and this is I believe most bottlenose dolphins, and the reason why they called it crater feeding is because literally they go down, and once they make that hole in the sand, they pull out, and the sand falls into where the hole was made, and it looks like a crater. And there's been times that we've gone in certain places where there's been obviously a few animals that have gone through and done this, and it literally looks like a lunar landscape. There's just craters. And it's super cool.
That's so interesting too. So there must be something pretty juicy down there if there's like the majority of them are doing it to some degree, and they're doing it that consistently in certain patches.
Yeah, and those certain areas was like, okay, well, that was a really good crater feeding area,
right?
Whatever was rich with that species. And the fact that the spotted dolphins don't do it, right? They will feed at the bottom. They'll feed on flounder that are just below the surface, but the ones that the bottlenose dolphins are feeding on are quite far down. If they're maybe going a foot or more into the ground, into the sand. And so the really unique thing about this is that you're not supposed to be able to echolocate through sand.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too, because that's how they.
They're like you can't do that. You can't do that. And dolphins are like, watch me.
Just kidding.
Right. So that's why people, humans, are so interested in learning more about how dolphins echolocate, because they can do it way better than we can artificially with our sonar. Like our sonar can't do that, as far as I know. I mean, maybe there's some special military grade that can right now, but that's why they're interested in looking at them, because they can do that when you're not supposed to be able to.
Right.
So that was a really fun one that I got to have personal experience with. Like I said, I don't think there's any other that I know of that do that particular type of feeding, so there's some that are unique to certain populations, and then there's others that are spread out amongst populations, but still unique in the animal kingdom. So we're going to stay in the Bahamas, right, Trevor?
Yes, we are.
Or Florida and Bahamas.
Florida, yeah.
I mean, we were based in Florida. We went to Bahamas for our work. It's only about 60 miles, something like that.
This one I'm going to be talking about is in the Keys, so it's close.
So we got Florida and the Bahamas, and then the Keys are just down there, so in the same vicinity. And the Gulf of Mexico too is all kind of together there.
So in that area, there's a feeding called mud plume feeding, which you might have seen on a nature documentary. I think I have at some point.
Yeah, I think it was actually on either Blue Planet or Planet Earth.
One of them.
I'm pretty sure, because they had the beautiful drone footage that was just like, this is so cool.
Right. So mud plume feeding is essentially the same idea as the bubble net feeding that we've seen, the humpbacks that we've mentioned before. But in this case, what happens is this is like a very isolated population that does this. I don't think that's been seen anywhere else. Kind of like
I don't think so either. Yeah.
But what they do is these dolphins will go into shallow water. I think the average was like a meter deep. And once they find a school of forage fish, one dolphin will circle that school of fish and then beat its tail on the bottom of the muddy sediment, usually in like eelgrass areas.
Yeah, so just like the bubbles, right?
Right. And it creates a wall essentially of mud around these fish, and the fish are like, where do I go? Because there's a wall. And that's so shallow they can't go above the wall because there's the surface water.
Right.
So once this happens, this is all in the span of like 20 seconds. They do it, and then the dolphins will just lunge through and grab a fish, and lunge through and grab a fish, lunge through, grab a fish. So what I thought was interesting was during these observations, it was like 95% of the lunges, the dolphins have their right side towards the bottom. So they're coming on the right side. And there's a lot of other studies that show that bottlenose dolphins prefer their right side on things, like their right eye. They did a captive study showing that they preferred that. The stranding feeding that they do into the Carolinas, they mostly go on their right side.
I think Kat's going to talk about that one, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And there's also asymmetry in their esophagus, where their right side of the esophagus is larger. So they think maybe going on your right side and grabbing a fish with larger prey items, it's easier to swallow with gravity.
That makes sense.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, interesting. I knew about the mud plume thing, but I didn't realize that it was sided like the stranding one is.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because they are finding more and more that, especially foraging and mating strategies in all cetaceans, they all show a preference for side.
Well, and we talked about that with gray whales.
They are like sided. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because the gray whales had a side too as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really interesting. It is kind of to some degree analogous to humans. A lot of people are right-handed versus left-handed. Occasionally people are ambidextrous, but yeah, mostly there is kind of a preferred side.
You prefer one side versus the other. Yeah.
Right. So that was pretty interesting.
Cool.
And they also found that they usually do it when the tide is flooding rather than ebbing.
Well, that makes sense.
But that's probably because the fish are coming in with the flood.
Right. You also don't want to get stuck.
Right.
Like, I'm so busy eating. Wait, where'd the water go?
They're trying to decide if this is like a new behavior. I mean, they discovered it in 1999, but who knows if they've been doing it before that, before being closely studied for it.
Right.
But
Well,
the
it's the
first
same thing with the
paper-
crater feeding too. It's like, well, we saw it then, but we don't know when they started it.
Yeah.
You know, this could
Once
be
you
things
find it,
they've
then you
always
focus
done.
on it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that one's in the Florida Keys. And then I can switch to the complete opposite side of the earth and focus on that population.
Globe?
This one's kind of cool. This one is in the Western Australia of Shark Bay, if
Right.
you've heard of that. And this is called sponging. And what these dolphins do is they'll rip off a barrel sponge off the bottom of the bay and associated area around it.
Mhm.
And what they do is they take this sponge and they wrap it around the rostrum. And with this sponge, they'll go down into the sediment and dig around for bottom fish. And then once the fish gets freaked out from the sifting, like, oh no, it comes out, they drop the sponge, they come up to surface, get air, and then come and grab the fish.
Mhm.
Wow.
So this is the first use of tools in the bottlenose dolphins in the wild that they've
Yeah,
identified.
I think it was a big deal when this one came out because this was the first time, like outside of primates, you know, that and certain other terrestrial animals that you could demonstrate that this was it's not, they're not using it to help eat, they're using it to get the thing that they're eating.
Right.
Right.
They're smart.
Yeah. Well, and that's the
Dolphins
thing
are
where, again,
smart.
just like like psychologically having that, you know, that differentiation, like the kind of, you know, the implied planning of that, where like A equals B, but I need to get to B and I can't get to it, so I need to involve something else to get myself to B or to get B into me, you know.
Right.
So it's kind of
Yeah, something
interesting
that's
just how
not
it, like those additional steps, you know.
right, because it's not like obvious that if I pick up a sponge, I'll be able to get this fish. It's
Right. That's what I mean. Yeah. It's like that's, and I think that's where some people like, well, of course, like, again, they're smart animals. Of course they'd be doing that. But it's like, when you actually break it down from a psychological perspective, there are very few species that have been proven to be able to make that cognitive correlation.
right.
And I guess I should
I'm sure a lot
clarify
of them
too.
can, but just, you know, what we've
Right.
studied.
I guess I should mention the use of the sponge isn't necessarily for digging. Like they could dig with their rostrum if they wanted to, but it's more of a protective device that they use with their
Right.
sensitive rostrum. So they, you know, there's urchins, there's coral bits, there's rocks versus like the muddy plumes. So they want to protect themselves in doing that.
Right, that's what I was going to ask because I was like, I'm pretty sure that it has to do with protection.
That's
Yep.
yeah, that's the get.
Which again,
Which is,
it says
again, really smart.
right, like oh, I could do this, or I could do this without getting
Yeah,
punctured all over my
like,
mouth.
lives to help you.
Right?
It's not their only foraging method. It's just a method. You know, they'll do the typical
Yeah.
open water fishing. But what was interesting was it's mainly females that do this versus males.
Mhm.
So the female, and I think it's evidence of a culture seen in the
Mhm.
dolphins too, which is kind of a big research area lately, especially with humpbacks, teaching vocalizations and such.
Right,
So it's
because
not like-
isn't it within matriline, like it's daughters that are learning it
Yes.
from their mothers?
Yeah, it's like not in their genes, but the mother will teach their kids, mainly daughters, to do it.
Mhm.
And then the daughters usually learn and then they'll do it and so on. And not so much with the males, and their guess was because males are busy doing more things, like finding mates and, you know,
They've
when
got
they can
other
eat,
priorities and things.
you know.
Well, and again, going back to the pregnant females and needing more energy and stuff like that, even if you're not pregnant yet, you have to invest more in the health of your body to be able to carry babies than a male is to be able to create sperm. So
That's true.
you know, maybe that's just like we need to invest in this and making sure that's, you know, you have that resource that's available to you for when you get pregnant, versus males are like, whatever, I'll find a fish wherever, I don't matter, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Oh, one more thing to say about this too. They were questioning why they would do this essentially. Like why would you switch from your food source here that's pretty reliable to suddenly just digging in the mud? And their guess was you have to echolocate for one to find fish usually. And they usually focus, the echolocation bounces off the swim bladder of a fish, which like imagine a balloon in your body that you can inflate or deflate for buoyancy. So that's what they normally do for buoyant fish, but these fish on the bottom don't have that. So rather than being energetically costly echolocating for these fish, they might not do that, which they switch to energetics using the tool but they also hypothesized that these bottom fish are more nutritious than those in the open water.
Oh,
Gotcha.
interesting.
So
Right, so like
more
somebody
reward.
discovered that and then was like,
Yeah.
oh. Well, and that goes to what I was saying with the other one, where it was like, it may be that for whatever reason, the other species, their normal species, are kind of lower or reduced, or there's higher competition. So it kind of forces some to be like, well, I need to find something else. And then these things come from that, right?
Right.
And we talked about that with the porpoises too, right? If maybe their prey is going down, and that's why they're starting to go look for those larger fish. From, if you listen to that podcast, so it kind of makes sense. Where there's a certain saying that goes along with that, of basically like, when you can't find something, it makes you become more imaginative to figure something else out.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
So continuing on in Australia, correct?
Yeah, so actually this is kind of funny. So we're going to be going in a little bit of a loop today. So we started off talking about the US and the southern US and kind of central area. Then we went to Western Australia. So I'm going to pick it up in Western Australia, and then I'm going to conclude by talking about one of the strategies that's used on the east coast of the US. So actually the one that Trevor mentioned already, the strand feeding. So first of all, we're going to talk about Western Australia and the octopus tossing. So like Cindy mentioned earlier, I know, it's really cool. So like Cindy mentioned earlier, we see this in our study site with the seals. The harbor seals will do a very, very similar motion. So if you live in the Washington area and you have ever seen harbor seals tossing an octopus, this is a really similar motion. But basically, this is something that has been identified in bottlenose dolphin populations around the world. Like, it isn't actually just located in Australia, but that happens to be where they've studied it the most rigorously. And I was actually lucky enough to get to see this when I was doing my internship in Australia. I was living and working in Bunbury, which is where the study is that was documenting this behavior. So this was a regular part of our transects, as we would see dolphins performing octopus tosses pretty regularly out there, which is really neat. And it was really loud, like, because a lot of, we'd start on the boat at like 5 a.m. And so you'd be out there and it's still kind of dusky because, they're fairly close to the equator. So even in summer, it takes a little bit for the sun to come up. And all of a sudden you just hear this massive like slap on the water. So it was always really like, what is yeah, exactly. It just, and like I said, you hear it out here too. Even, the seal can be at the complete other end of Burroughs Pass, and we can still hear it really, really loudly. So basically, like I said, this is a strategy that they've developed to kind of stun the animal and hopefully kill it. Because, if anyone has seen an octopus, they like to fight back, exactly. And also a strategy to, tenderize and break up the animal. So the actual methodology for doing the octopus toss, they've kind of broken it down into like, this is exactly what each step is doing, which I thought was really cool. So, so kind of what you mentioned with the catfish, Cindy, they will intentionally try to bite off the head first, which I thought was really cool. I didn't know that.
Separate the brain from the rest of it.
Right. And then after they bite the head off, and again, they don't always manage to do that, but that's kind of the preferred method. Then they'll shake the body and toss it repeatedly against the water. So they'll literally like toss it into the air and then swim after it and go get it. So they're not always in their mouth while they're slapping it. They'll do both.
Oh, so
but that
like
was what was kind of interesting. They literally throw it across the water and then they'll swim after it.
That's awesome.
Which is kind of an interesting strategy. You have to be pretty confident that no one's going to get to it before you do.
Well, that's the thing I was thinking. Like, if you throw it too far, like if there's another dolphin over there, I'd be like, thanks.
Right. Which again, if they're part of the same population, maybe not. Like maybe they'd be like, oh, cool, you keep killing it and then I'll grab a bite. That would be great. Who knows? So like I said, they'll shake it, they'll toss it repeatedly until the octopus arms are tenderized. So they can actually like swallow it more effectively. And most importantly, so that the suction cups no longer function. And I'll get to why that's important at the end.
Okay, because I was like, I think there's a reason.
No spoilers.
If you separate
no
the head,
spoilers.
yes. Okay.
Yeah. So that's important, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And like I said, the tossing and repeated slamming into the water as well also helps to break the octopus up physically. So again, they can actually swallow bite-sized chunks. So like I said, this has been really well studied in the Bunbury area, which is in Western Australia. It's a little bit south of Perth. So I believe that's actually north of Shark Bay, where Trevor was referring to. And again, like, it's kind of interesting because like these dolphins do also forage on fish quite regularly. So it does seem like this is maybe just in addition to their diet. It's not necessarily something that they're doing a ton. Like, it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily like a predominant component of their diet, but it's certainly a consistent part of it.
And worth the risk for whatever reason.
Right, exactly. And so both of the strategies, I mean, kind of all of them, especially with the catfish one, like kind of all the ones that we've talked about have their own risks inherent to them. But both of the ones that I'm going to be talking about are both pretty risky strategies.
They probably take the cake.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So this one, like Cindy mentioned, if you don't disable those suction cups, that might be a bit of a problem. So there was an animal actually from the Bunbury population named Gilligan.
Oh, his name was Gilligan? I didn't know
Gilligan. And he died in 2015. There was a report published on this in 2018, which is kind of when it hit the news headlines. So you might have already heard about this a couple of years ago. But he was found dead with an octopus halfway down his throat.
And it was like the whole tentacle.
So its tentacle reached all the way down into the animal's first stomach. So dolphins have 3 stomachs for processing. But it was all the way down from his from right here in like his gullet area, from like he hadn't even fully swallowed it yet.
Yep.
And its tentacle had to be, so it must have been a pretty big octopus, first of all.
Yeah, have like a couple of feet worth of tentacle in you.
Right. So basically what happened was the octopus suctioned onto the dolphin's larynx, so effectively blocked its airway, and they both died. So obviously the octopus was still alive enough when it was in the mouth to be fighting, and the dolphin was obviously alive because it was trying to eat it. So kind of a clash of the titans here. Like, nobody won in this situation.
If you're gonna take me down, I'm gonna take you down with me.
pretty much. So this was actually the first instance documented of a dolphin dying from octopus asphyxiation. And it also really highlights why it's so important to repeatedly toss and slam the octopus on the water surface, because what they think is that, Gilligan was a male, and they think that maybe he got a little bit cocky and didn't fully, or just wasn't competent maybe in doing this behavior, and so didn't fully either kill or stun or disable those suction cups enough so that when he did try to consume it, the animal was still able to fight back.
Because isn't there, and I don't know if I'm taking this from another species, but I think it is that even when the animal dies, the suction cups and like the tentacles can continue to move for a while and before it finally finishes. So you may kill it, but you got to wait a couple minutes before those.
Or keep tossing it so that muscular response is completely disabled.
Right.
So that's, again, that's why they would bite off the head first, so it can't keep initiating that contraction of the suction cup. But, like you said, even after the head has been taken off, those suction cups can still suction on and hold on.
And those suction cups, I mean, octopuses are extremely strong. So one suction cup can pick up like 40 or 50 pounds or something like that.
Yeah. I was going to say, I meant to actually look that up and I forgot to, about how much one suction cup can actually hold in terms of weight. But, and again, they've had other, in addition to the risk of just dying,
right?
They've also had several other instances where octopus that have been, in theory, a prey item of the dolphin, have latched onto other parts of their body. So they've had instances where they've latched onto the blowhole, so on top, where they've gotten around and up onto the back of the animal and then latched onto the blowhole, which is never a good thing. Apparently also in one instance in Greece, they saw an octopus that had latched onto the dolphin's genitals.
Oh, that's...
Which that's really, that's like you're not going to eat me today.
Was it a male that had or was it just
I don't know. I don't know. It just said it had latched onto the genitals.
Well, either way, it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
I've seen that picture going around everywhere too lately of there's a dolphin with a octopus on his back, essentially, just letting go.
Just riding it, I'm riding.
Which again, that's a great strategy.
Dolphin jumps out, still on the back,
and I mean, octopuses are extremely intelligent, right? They can do puzzles. They can get themselves out of anything. So it
makes sense that they would use that kind of evasive tactic and if I can just get behind the head, it can't get me because it can't reach back there. Pretty smart.
So it's instead of this being the battle of like fighting, like physical fighting. It's the battle of the wits. Right? The battle of mind. How can I outwit you?
Yeah.
To not die.
Yeah, so like I said, that's the first strategy that I'm talking about. And like I said, it was really interesting. I never saw any that were like that dramatic where it was latched onto weird parts, but it was definitely really cool to see them doing. And like I said, I mean, it was interesting just to see, like, they don't toss it super far away. It's usually about 2 to 3 feet away from them.
Right.
But I mean, they start under the water and then like wrench the animal like up and round. So they try to toss in kind of an arc. So instead of going far, it kind of comes down fairly close, but it comes down with force.
Yeah, which
It's
makes
like-
more sense because if you're doing it farther away, it's gonna not be as forceful.
Right. Yeah. So that's the first of the strategies. And the second one, like I said, we're now going all the way back to ish where we started in the US.
Full circle.
On the East Coast this time. And this is the one that Trevor already mentioned. So in South Carolina and Georgia, bottlenose dolphins will engage in what's called strand feeding. And so as the name implies, this is literally dolphins intentionally stranding themselves to catch prey.
And
this is,
I think, wasn't this is one of the first ones, at least that, and from my thinking of learning about all these different strategies, that was one of the first ones that I remember going like, oh, wow, that's weird. And then from that, we found all these other different ones. But this was like the first one, like, whoa, this is interesting and different.
Yeah, and it makes sense that that would be the case because this is happening, you know, kind of along the coastline. There's a bunch of people right there. You can observe it. It's not really in the water column per se. And this is all kind of in fairly shallow water as well. And a lot of this is happening in very built up kind of resort type areas around the Carolinas. When I was researching this, actually, it was really interesting because several of the very high class resorts and high class like private communities actually had this behavior listed on their website as like an attraction for living there. Yeah. Then and it was, I mean, it was really
if
cute.
You buy a
like,
house here, you too can see it.
Yeah, literally. And they're like, our dolphins have engaged in this behavior and it's this really cool thing and you can be privileged to see it too. And it was really neat.
That's kind of smart.
Plus it was also, I thought, really cool because they were kind of informing potential residents or clients that like, they're okay, leave them alone.
Right. Please don't call the stranding network. They're doing this on purpose.
Exactly.
Unless one's stuck there and
which again, so that's again why it's a risky strategy. So what basically happens with this, and again, you may have seen this, I believe this was on, I think it was definitely on Blue Planet. I think it might have also been featured on like Planet Earth.
Yeah, it's on, I've seen it a couple places now.
Yeah, I know this one has been featured on several documentaries. But again, the strategy behind this is that it's a group foraging effort. So instead of the octopus toss, which is kind of a singular animal doing this, this one is definitely a group feeding tactic. So what happens is a group of bottlenose dolphins, I think they have said that they saw it with just one individual doing it, but it's really most effective when you're doing it in a group.
I've only seen pictures of them with like 4 or 5 individuals doing it, yeah.
Yeah, it's likely that if it's an individual doing it, maybe they're practicing. I think is kind of the consensus that like you'll see them do it, but they're not necessarily doing it for efficiency per se. It might just be to sort of practice the behavior.
Right.
So anyway, what they do is they get into a group and they will start corralling fish or shrimp kind of around a sandbar or beach area. And once they kind of get the fish and shrimp together in some sort of ball, the dolphins will come back together in a line and they will rush towards the shore. So towards the food, which is, you know, closer to the shoreline. And basically the fish and shrimp are then pushed by that tidal wave that the dolphins moving creates onto the shore or the mud bank or the sandbar, wherever they're actually, you know, whatever the substrate happens to be. And so then the dolphins keep coming after they've created this tidal wave, push the food up onto the shore, is washed onto shore. The dolphins themselves then kind of jump onto the shore, and it's kind of a half of still riding the tidal wave, half of kind of a physical jump onto the shore. And they'll grab the fish then and the shrimp that are on the sand, and they'll literally, again, like you said, on their side. So I guess I should go this way, on their right side, preferentially, and they'll just snap and grab. And I have some pictures of it that we'll put up here, but and they'll just snap and grab at the fish that's stuck on the shore.
And I always remember seeing it, and then like the fish are like jumping, you know, they're like, you put a fish out of water, it's like, so it's like, no, I'm trying to grab these crazy things.
Yeah, and it said that they mostly target fish such as mullet and Atlantic menhaden, I don't know how to say that. Menhaden, I've never heard of that one, but
associated with mullet.
Yeah, I know that's kind of the main species that they'll go after for this, and the shrimp, obviously. Right. And then they'll basically just slide or wriggle back into the water, and the reason they think this works is that most of the places they're doing this, it's not a huge incline. So they are doing it on fairly either low grade or kind of flat beaches or mud banks. And a lot of, especially when they're mud banks, it's fairly slippery. Plus they did just create a tidal wave to get the fish on there. So again, the majority of the time they can, you know, finagle themselves back off there. But every once in a while, you know, like we talked about earlier, one will get stuck. And it tends to be younger animals who are less adept at doing the behaviors. So maybe they get a little excited and propel themselves too far up the shore.
That was my first thing. I was like, down. If you're too strong, it's not going to be a good thing.
Yeah. So this is, again, like it definitely, and it is a taught behavior. So as Trevor mentioned with the one that you were talking about, this is again taught from mothers to their calves. They didn't mention specifically teaching female calves necessarily. They just referenced that the mothers will teach their calves how to do it. But again, it's just another example of that cultural transmission.
Well, and it makes sense too with the females that I forgot to mention earlier, is that in most mammal populations, but in particular the bottlenose dolphins, females will stay in the area that their mothers are. Like it's called natal philopatry. So they will stay in that area. So they're going to be around their mothers more often. Whereas males are the ones that are like, I'm going to go off and spread my seeds somewhere else, and they pop off. So they're going to be around their mothers longer to learn those techniques than the males will be.
Right. So yeah, like I said, I mean, again, another risky strategy, although this is one that they've been documenting for, I think this is at least several decades at this point that they've been documenting this behavior. I think I remember reading something that, like, it was, I know it's definitely been documented since the early 90s, if not the 80s. So it's definitely
it's been around since I started in the field, and that was 20 years ago. So
so I mean, it's one that we do know a little bit more about, and like I said, part of that is just because we can observe it a little bit easier because it is on land.
And one thing I'm pretty sure is one reason they know, besides seeing that the animals do it on the right side all the time, is that when they've gotten a stranded animal or whatnot, that their teeth are worn down on that side because they're eating the mud and stuff along with the
you're crunching sand.
Lovely.
So they need some and just one. And I think also they'll find that, like, that side of the rostrum is kind of abraded down as well. Like,
I would think so. I mean, you're basically exfoliating yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So just one last thing on this. It's a facial.
It's a facial as long as you're eating. It's good.
Right, exactly. So just one last thing about this behavior too is just, it's really interesting to note that because they are doing this in, like I said, it's kind of the South Carolina area, Georgia, near the Outer Banks and that kind of thing. Like, this is a pretty populous area. A lot of people live along that coastline now. And so it is really important to note that because this is, especially because this is a taught behavior, human intervention in any way, so like either reducing the prey to the point where they can't practice this behavior anymore, interrupting the prey, interrupting the practice of the behavior rather, so like freaking out and thinking that they're stranding unintentionally, breaking it up, trying to shove the animals back into the water, not knowing what's happening, that can really impact the transmission of this behavior to the next generation. So it's just kind of interesting to note that, like, even if we're not consciously harming the animal, if we insert ourselves somewhere into these behavioral patterns, we can actually completely mess up either how it's performed and how effectively it's performed, or even the passing on of that behavior to other generations. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting point to note about that one, especially things that are culturally passed on.
And if they do begin to rely on that more than other ways of getting food, and they lose that, then they may not have the ability to go backwards, basically, and be able to catch
and it kind of comes back around to what we discussed with the southern resident killer whales up here. They're so attuned to knowing how to hunt for the Chinook salmon and for salmonids in general, and that is another taught behavior. But it's something, when you become too reliant on that, you do limit your other food sources. If that food source becomes impacted in any way, that could then impact your entire population. Just kind of an interesting one to note.
Yeah, and that actually rounds out perfectly with the what I wanted to finish up on, is the fact that these bottlenose dolphins, I mean, and we just touched on a few, there are other some other behavioral foraging strategies I'm sure that they have that we have not talked about, But what that's called is called behavioral plasticity. So the more you are able to figure out different ways of doing things, the better off you're going to be, right? We're just talking about with the specific versus being able to do a bunch of different things. So the fact that some of these animals can figure out, oh, this is something I can exploit, and then pass that on to either within generations, or there are cases where animals are teaching it to peers, right? It's not from family, it's peer to peer. So the ability to do that greatly increases your ability to survive when things change. And that is really important right now, because regardless of what we do from now on, things are changing, right? We've changed the world as it is. How it goes forward and how it changes from there is another story. What we do, but the world is changing, and even without us changes, right? Nature changes over time. So your ability, the fact that bottlenose dolphins have this behavioral plasticity, and you see all these different populations with different strategies, and even within a population having 2 different strategies, really puts them at a better place to be survivability wise in the long term.
Right.
So bottlenose dolphins, good job. For being so smart. So that is, anybody else have any last comments?
I think that covers me.
All right. So that was our foraging strategies, bottlenose dolphin specifics. And they're really cool, and we'll try to link to some of the papers that we talked about that actually have pictures of, and some of them are in color, which is like the catfish one is in color. The crater feeding one I have is in black and white because that was from 1997. So back in the day. And you can also, some of those you can look on YouTube. If you look up like octopus tossing, you can find that on YouTube.
I actually have a really great sequence of photographs too that
cool.
the woman I was working for actually published as part of that document. So
sweet.
It's very cool.
Yeah, so we'll try to link to as many of those as we can so that you can see what we're talking about, because it is really, really neat to see. And just think about, while you're watching it, how smart these animals are to have figured out how to do these different things. It's just pretty amazing.
Yeah.
All right, so that wraps us up for this week, and we'll be with you next week doing something new. We're not sure what yet.
Knows?
Who knows? But it'll be interesting regardless. So that's it for us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
This was brought to you by Pacific Mammal Research, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. To learn more about the species we discuss, check out our blog. Head to our website, www.pacmam.org, that's PACMAM.org, to check it out. Also, help us continue providing fun and educational content like this by donating today. Your help is how we can continue to do our work and share it with you. Thanks.